21st, and a quorum is present. This is the Minnesota State Education Finance Committee, and it will now come to order. Today, we will be hearing presentations from the state demographer about the future of Minnesota's, the current population and the future population of Minnesota's students. Our nonpartisan staff member, Jenna Hofer, will present the November forecast, and MDE's Kathy Erickson will provide a presentation on special education forecast projections. So I'm really excited to kick off our first Senate Education Committee meeting of the 2025 and the new biennium. This year, we are able to have a very unique opportunity due to the temporary Senate tie, which is why Senator Rarick and I will be co-chairing this committee until the tie changes. We have an agreement to share the gavel, so as you see today, I have the gavel, and then I will hand it over to Senator Rarick at the end of this hearing to chair it tomorrow, with Thursday as a flex day. This pattern is going to continue for the entirety of the power sharing agreement. So I would like to now turn it over to my co-chair, Senator Rarick, if he'd like to make some opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Really don't have anything prepared. I just want to say thank you. Appreciated the work we've already done, kind of setting a brief agenda for these first couple of meetings, and look forward to continuing our discussions and working towards what will in the end be our omnibus bill.
Thank you, and I do look forward to working with you all this session. I just want to point out that our pages this year are led by Olivia Mackel Wiederander. We have Michael Edwards here, Sunny Amente, and today we have Chloe Ade. They will be assisting us with virtual speakers, sharing documents, and helping our committee hearings run very smoothly. So thank you, Olivia, for returning. They're all back there. Please stop and say hello to them. Thank you, Olivia, for returning again this year. Welcome, Michael, Sunny, and Chloe. I think we should probably take a minute to introduce all the members on our committee. We have some new members that were assigned. So I'm thinking, let's see. There we go. So I would just like us all to maybe go around and introduce ourselves, maybe share your name, the district you represent, and then answer this little question. If you had to teach a class on one thing, what would you teach? Think about that for a minute. What would you teach if you could teach one class on one thing? And I think we will start on this end with Senator Westland. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, I'm going to try and take up a little time till I can think of something. Senator Bonnie Westland, I am from Senate District 42 in Plymouth, and I guess if I had a chance to teach anything, it would be civics.
Hi, Senator Michael Kroon, District 32, Blaine, Ham Lake, Lexington, and Columbus in Anoka County. If I had to teach a class and I were getting paid to do it, it'd have to be something I'd feel comfortable knowing something about, so I'll say something in the law. Let's say constitutional law.
Good morning. My name is Claire Umuver-Baton. I represent District 66. My dad is a now retired public school teacher, and he taught history, so I'd probably follow in his footsteps.
Good morning, Senator Erin May Quaid. I represent Senate District 56, which is Apple Valley, Rosemount, and a small portion of Egan. I happen to represent the district that I graduated from. If I was going to teach a class, I think I would do something on literary great books that maybe aren't currently taught but have really great literary value.
Ralph Farnsworth, State Senator for District 7. which is most of the Iron Range, about half of Aiken County, a lot of Itasca County, and probably some, well, maybe just Civil War, anything in the Civil War, probably.
Karen Johnson, I'm the legislative assistant for Senator Jason Rarick. I would teach Algebra 2.
Ed Cook, I'm on staff with the Senate Republican Caucus, and I like all the subjects, would teach any of them except foreign languages and music, because that would be a disaster.
Senator Jason Rarick, District 11, so all of Pine and Carleton County, half of Kanabec, and little bits of Chisago and St. Louis County. If I were to teach a class, I would like to teach something to help students be aware of all their education opportunities from the 2-year trade schools and apprenticeship programs to the 4 years, as well as the different opportunities for careers that are out there.
Senator Mary Kunesh, I represent District 39, which are the communities of St. Anthony Village and New Brighton, Columbia Heights and Hilltop, Spring Lake Park, and Fridley. And if I could teach one class, I really think I would want to teach accounting. That class really had a huge impact on getting my mind organized around finance, and I think it would make a really big difference for a lot more kids.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Zellmer. I'm the committee administrator for the Senate Education Finance Committee and Senator Kunesh. If I had to teach any subject, I'd teach a facts class, specifically the sewing lessons.
My name is Tessa Yeager. I am the legislative assistant to Senator Kunesh, and if I had to teach a class, I would probably teach a class on sustainability.
Good morning. My name is Jenna Hofer. I'm the nonpartisan fiscal analyst assigned to the committee. If I had to teach any class, I would probably teach something along the lines of personal finance or public budgeting.
Madam Chair, members, my name is Bjorn Arneson. I'm a nonpartisan analyst assigned to this committee. If I were to teach a class, I would probably teach something related to music theory.
Chair members, I am Anne-Marie Lewis, the Senate counsel for the committee, and if I were to teach a class, I could be free-ranging. Following in footsteps, my grandfather was a PhD in library science, so maybe something with the libraries, or my father, for a little while, was a law professor in addition to corporate counsel.
Hi, I'm Heather Gustafson. I represent SD 36, which is 9 cities, but the biggest ones are Vadnais Heights, White Bear Lake, and Lino Lakes. I am a history teacher, so I'll go with what I know. I taught U.S. and world history for many, many years.
Good morning. The committee table is much more full than it was last year, so this takes a little getting used to. Eric Lucero from the communities of Albertville, St. Michael, Otsego, Elk River area. I have taught for 7 years college, cybersecurity, computer forensics related courses, but those are not as fun as they used to be for me. I have taught biblical courses on Old Testament and New Testament for probably a decade now. That is very exciting and exhilarating, so I would probably continue the biblical studies courses.
Good morning, everybody. Steve Swodzinski, Eden Prairie, Minnetonka, and I was fortunate that I got to teach my dream job for over 30 years, American government. So what would come second to that, I'm not sure, but probably a course on the Beatles.
And Senator Lang is online. Senator Lang, would you like to introduce yourself and let us know what you would like to teach?
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Senator Andrew Lang. I represent 4 counties in southwest Minnesota, Candioi County, Renville, Chippewa, and Meeker counties. So it's a pretty vast area. And if I had to teach, I shouldn't say had to, if I got to teach a class, I think it would be flight instruction. So it's the one area I know something about, and I think I could be dangerous if it was for some young students.
Well, thank you for sharing. Senator Housley is also been assigned to this committee, so if and when she comes in, we will see what she has to say about what she would like to teach. We will move right along with a presentation. We're going to hear from our Minnesota State demographer, Susan Brower. So if you'd like to get yourself settled in. And speakers, when you turn your mic on at the desk, please do it when you're ready to speak, and then state your name and your title for the record. And then there is a clipboard usually to sign in, but we know who you are. And then members, just remember that when you speak, you'll need to turn your mics back on, and then be sure to snap it off when you're finished, because your mic is hot until it is turned off. And when you are ready, Ms. Brower, you may begin.
Thank you, Chair Kunesh. My name is Susan Brower. I'm the state demographer, and I work in the Department of Administration. So I've been asked to share with you today some information about the demographics of Minnesota's school-age children, and also what the population will look like into the future. So that's what I've prepared for you. I will also talk a little bit about trends in child poverty and what that looks like across districts. There were just under 1 million school-age children in Minnesota in 2023, which is the most recent data that we have from the Census Bureau. Something of note is that the older adult population, for the first time in our state's history, became more populous than the school-age population in 2023. We knew those lines were about to cross, and that happened in the last set of data that were released. For most of this presentation, when I say school-age children, I'm talking about the 5 to 17 population, the number of children living in the state or living in a district, rather than those who are enrolled in public schools. I'm talking about residents rather than enrollment. I'm also showing you here the geographic distribution of students across the state, just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like visually on this map. I know it's a little hard, it's quite hard to see, but each dot on this map represents 500 school children. And so, like the population, children are concentrated, particularly in the Twin Cities metro, where 56% of school-age children live in the 7 counties. But we also see concentrations in other metros like Duluth, St. Cloud, Rochester, Mankato, Moorhead. You can kind of see the clusters on this map. We also see clusters of children much smaller, but of course they're visible here on this map. Children along the Iron Range cities, Hibbing, Mountain Iron, Eveleth, Grand Rapids, and Brainerd and Bemidji. You can see kind of those clusters there. Also along the southern edge, the clusters of cities in Worthington, Fairmont, Albert Lee, and Austin. Generally, I'm just giving this to you as a visual to kind of get the sense of that geographic distribution. And here we have the long-term historical trend of the number of school-age children in the state. You can see it grew in the 1990s as the children of the baby boomers, the millennial generation, moved into their school years, and has remained pretty flat since that time, pretty stable. We do anticipate that over the next 15 to 20 years, we'll see about a 5% reduction in the number of school-age children, the result of declining birth rates. That's for the state overall. If we look region by region, we do see quite a bit of difference in terms of what the projections look like, with the northern part of the state seeing the largest declines and the most consistent declines. So you can see here, these projections that we have are based on the economic development regions, which you can see in the map on the left. And you can see that the Northwest, EDR, the Headwaters, and the Arrowhead both have projected declines in the share or the percentage of school children for the next 2 decades. We have growth projected for the central part of the state, the southwest part of the state. We also have decline, the southwest EDR, we also have a decline projected for the next 2 decades, and then there's kind of a mix for the Twin Cities and the southeast region. What's driving a lot of this change is the declining birth rates over time. And you can see that just looking at our age structure. We're looking here at the number of children ages 0 to 17, with 17 at the top, and you can see that at the bottom it's kind of pinched in, and that's just because we've had a declining number of births year over year since 2007. And so as that younger cohort ages into the school age, we know that those numbers will continue to fall, at least at the state level. Now, looking at the county level change that we've seen in the last few years, it kind of gives us a sense of where those growth areas are that are driven by demographics. And in this map, the blue counties that we see here are the counties that were growing in terms of the school age population. And it's really along, it's the kind of north of the Twin Cities metro and along the I-94 corridor is where we've seen growth in that population. All of these counties that you see here on the map will be impacted by declining birth rates. But if there's in-migration of families, if families are moving into new housing developments or they're moving into communities replacing older families that don't have school children, that's where we'll really see that growth. So while the lower birth rates are still a factor, we'll really see a lot more growth in those areas where we have more in-migration of young families. You can see that the largest annual gains, so these are average annual gains in the school age population, occurred in Anoka, Stearns, and Sherburne County. We also have gains in Lyon County. And the largest annual losses, now this is in numeric terms, were for Hennepin and Ramsey County. In percentage terms, it's a similar picture, but a little bit different, especially from the perspective of the county itself. You can see again that there's growth along that I-94 corridor, but now we see a higher percentage growth for Lyon, Todd, and Kanabec counties, and the largest annual losses for Kitson, Rock, and Aiken. Oftentimes this has to do with the age of the population, so there's just not as many people in the parenting ages, there's not as much in-migration, and so you see those numbers drop off much more quickly in terms of the school age. So generally, whether we're looking at the raw numbers or we're looking at the percentages, the growth has really been along that I-94 corridor north of the Twin Cities, but then there are pockets where there's been growth outside as well when we're looking in terms of percentages. Now turning to some of the districts, we're going to see different patterns than we saw at the county level, just because within the county sometimes you have a district that's growing very rapidly and it's right next to a district, it's contained within that same county, a district that is declining in population. So we'll get a different pattern. It's a little bit hard to get your head around as you're going deeper into smaller geographic areas, but I'm showing you here the districts with the largest numeric gains between 2020 and 2023. And you can see that Wayzata, the district, which includes Plymouth, and I think it's the Plymouth part that is driving some of that change, is at the top in terms of the population added. I will say that some of these changes are related to demographic changes like births and migration that I was talking about. They may also have to do with boundary changes. So boundary changes are not accounted for in this particular data set. So if a district became larger because it had a larger geographic area and encompassed more children, that would show up as a population added here as well. St. Cloud, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan among the top, and you can see the percentages there on the right.
Ms. Bowser, we have a question. Senator Rarick would like to ask you a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would that potentially also include open enrollment as driving some of that change?
Ms. Bowser.
Thank you. Co-Chair Rarick, this is showing you the number of people, of school-age children, 5 to 17, living in the district. So regardless of where they're going to school, these are human bodies who are the right age. And I'm not sharing with you information about enrollment. This is just the people living there.
Thank you, Ms. Brower.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that. You'll get different enrollment numbers from the Minnesota Department of Ed for these districts. Again, these children may be open enrolled in private schools. They may be in charter schools, but this, again, are just the growth in the number of children in those districts. And here we have school districts with the largest numeric declines in resident population. There's so much variation from district to district in the number of children lost or gained that it was really hard to characterize it geographically. That's why I'm just showing you kind of the top number of losses and the top districts that gained. But I included in your materials also the full list if you're interested in particular districts to kind of scan that. But you can see here, St. Paul and Eden Prairie were among those schools with, or the districts with the largest losses. I want to turn now and talk a little bit about the student population themselves, students themselves. And here we're looking at the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of school-age children in Minnesota. We're looking on the left at the number or the proportion of school-age children by racial group, and you can see that over time there's been an increase in the number of students who are students of color. Today, about 35% of all those who are ages 5 to 17 in the state are children of color, and you can see that that's fairly well distributed between Black or African American, Asian, multiracial, and Latino. The group of multiracial children is one that has been growing, especially in the last decade, but has certainly been growing over time. So there's more kind of racial diversity within kind of what we think of as the 6 major racial groups. And you can see on the right the most recent data for that population, with 65% of Minnesota school-age children who are white, non-Hispanic, just about 1%, African American, Asian at 6.5%, Black or African American 9.2%, Latino 9.5%, and multiracial 9.5%. And we have some data from the most recent census on children with detailed racial groups. This is kind of newly released, even though the census now was close to 5 years ago. These data were just released last year. And this is one instance where we're not looking just at the school-age population, but this is all children under the age of 18. But you can see what the largest kind of detailed racial or cultural groups are. On the right, we have under the white racial group, the broader racial category, children who have ancestry that's German, Irish, Norwegian, as we might expect from our past immigration history in this state. But the largest groups of BIPOC children are Mexican at 82,000, African American at 69,000, Somali at 42,000, and Hmong at 36,000 was the estimate coming out of the 2020 census. Now, we would have expected that all of those groups to have grown a little bit since that time, just because it's been 5 years since those data were collected. I want to go a little bit more in depth about what we mean by diversity. We've looked at kind of detailed race and race in general, but we can look also at the nativity, or where the parents of school-aged children were born, whether it was in the US or outside of the US. And within Minnesota, about 20% of all school-aged children have at least one parent that was born in another country. 14% have both parents or two parents if they're in a two-parent family, or one parent foreign-born if they're in a one-parent family. So how does that compare to other states? 20% seems, I think it seems high to people because that's not a statistic that a lot of people are used to looking at. It's actually a little bit lower than the national average, where 25% of children this age nationally have at least one parent who was born in another country. Looking across the US, kind of the range of this particular situation, about 46% of children in California have a parent who's foreign born, compared with the lowest number for any state, which is 3% in West Virginia. And again, Minnesota's at 20%. Another way to think about diversity of children is to think about linguistic diversity. And this is a table that I shared when I presented to the committee a couple of years ago, and I updated it realizing that I was just updating the number, increasing the numbers a little bit since the last 2 years, which speaks to the fact that our children will continue to become more diverse into the future as our population becomes more diverse. This is MDE data, so this is actually looking at enrollments at this point, because this isn't data that we have from for all children living in the district. So again, MDE data of enrolled students for the 2023 to 2024 school year. It shows that about 18%, or 152,000 of Minnesota school children speak a language other than English at home. And this doesn't mean necessarily that they don't also speak English, it's just the primary language that they speak at home. About 58,000 children speak Spanish at home, the largest language group other than English. 26,000 speak Somali, and 20,000 speak Hmong at home. For Karen, those numbers drop off pretty quickly to about 5,000 school children, so a much smaller group. And then the next largest groups are Vietnamese, Arabic, and Oromo at about 3,000 to 4,000 speakers. One other thing that I wanted to point out on this particular graph is just to look at the geographic distribution of children who are speaking other languages at home. And in Minneapolis and St. Paul school districts, that is about 37% of those students enrolled jointly, speaking a language other than English at home. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here with a couple slides about the poverty of the school-age population, what that has looked like over time. Minnesota is the line represented in purple on this graph, so it's lower than the national average, but it has really followed the national trend very closely over time. After the Great Recession, we saw a rise in child poverty that really had a steady decline over the next decade up until 2020 with the pandemic. And again, we saw a rise in child poverty. It's now begun for Minnesota, we've begun to see it come down so that today, just under 10% of Minnesota school-aged children live in poverty compared to 15% nationally. So that's nearly 1 in 10 school-aged children in poverty in Minnesota. Finally, I just wanted to share what this looks like district by district. And you can see where the darkest areas of that bluish color is where you have the highest rates of poverty, and where the kind of lightish yellow color is where you see lower rates of poverty. So we see higher poverty concentrated in the center of the Twin Cities metropolitan area in Minneapolis and St. Paul and some of the first ring suburbs. You see much less poverty in the exurban areas and the suburban areas. And then up toward in northern Minnesota, we see much higher rates of poverty, particularly in districts with larger numbers of Native or Indigenous children, where you can see the Red Lake School District, Cass Lake, and Northland Community Schools among the highest rates of poverty in the state. So I've shared with you what I expect in terms of growth, where the growth areas are, what the student population looks like, especially with respect to diversity. I will say that our student population will continue to become more diverse, as our state will, regardless of what happens with international immigration, and that is because the parent generation is becoming more diverse. It's built into our age structure, and so we know that that will continue into the future. Not everywhere and in every district, but generally when we're looking at the numbers across the state. That's all that I have prepared. Chair Kunesh, if there's any question, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Ms. Brower. That is a good refresher of what our population, our student population looks like across the state. Are there any questions from anyone or comments? Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know part of your job is predicting the future, and it seems, I could have swore I saw this weekend that we were Minnesota's #2 in the nation on the best places to raise a family. And Massachusetts, I recall, or Maine, another M state was #1. Anyways, this graph on page 3 with a decrease of 5% over the next 15 years, is there any, that's a prediction on your part, was that taking into account that maybe a young family starting out in Georgia or Texas or another state might look at Minnesota as a great place to raise a family, and those numbers might not be as dire as maybe we're saying that they are going to be today? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Brower.
Chair Kunesh, Senator, it does take into account our recent history. And I will say that Minnesota has been, this is not a demographic fact, an opinion, it has been a great place to raise a family before those numbers came out. But what we see historically is we're losing more people to other states than we gain. In particular, we're losing more young people to other states than we gain. And when we slowly lose those young people, we eventually lose the children that they have to other states. This takes into account those patterns of migration that have been very stable over the last 20 or more years of slowly losing people to other states. It's not a Minnesota issue, it's kind of a Midwest issue, where the southwestern states tend to be the receivers of young people, and the southern states, and Midwestern and Northeastern states, including Massachusetts, if that's the other state, tend to be kind of net exporters of people. The decline that we're seeing here really is being driven by lower birth rates and not having the level of in-migration. That said, migration rates can change. They will change at some point because of climate change. But for now, we're projecting based on what we've seen for the last 20 years up until kind of the most recent period.
Thank you. Senator Mayquade.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's kind of a similar question to what Senator Swedzinski was asking, because, you know, through other work, have been connected to several hundred families that have moved to Minnesota. And I'm wondering what is, like, what type of number makes something statistically, like, countable or meaningful? Like, what kind of numbers would we need to see in order to maybe see it turn up on these projections?
Ms. Brower.
Chair Kunesh, Senator Mayquade, what we're seeing right now is a net loss of people. So we would have to see those numbers go positive. And it's not necessarily a level of statistical significance. It's more a level that we would see. We're taking the rate of migration in or out and kind of carrying that forward by age. And so we would certainly need to see it be a positive number in order to see an increased projection. I think what's much more likely is to see different patterns of international immigration influence these numbers, because the numbers of domestic migrants have been so stable and have been negative for so long for Minnesota that it's hard for me to imagine that that would change quickly. It's much more likely that we're going to see variation in the number of international immigrants that would impact, to Minnesota, that would impact these numbers.
Senator Cruen, question. I'm sorry, Farnsworth. Senator Farnsworth. Get my names right this year.
Thank you for that compliment, Madam Chair. I wish I was as smart as Senator Cruen. So you mentioned that more people are leaving Minnesota than people are coming in, and I have, of course, lots of theories about that have something to do with the conditions outside today. But are there surveys? Do you have some data on why the people that are coming here, why they're coming here, and the people that are leaving, why they're leaving? And I know that isn't specific to education finance, but it's just sort of a curiosity if you have that data.
Ms. Brower.
Chair Kunesh, Senator Farnsworth, there's not direct surveys for Minnesota asking people why they came or why they left, but we can look at the age of people who are migrating, and we can look at what they're doing after they migrate to give us some clues. Most of the people who are leaving the state are in their late teens and early 20s, and the vast majority are enrolled in post-secondary school after they move. So college migration is driving a lot of this. Many of those students come back after they graduate, but they don't, not as many come back as leave. And so there's kind of a slow siphoning off of people to other states that way. I would say that's the primary driver of the net losses is the migration of young people.
No? Anyone else? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this morning and giving us this overview of our student population. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right, next we will have a presentation from our non-partisan fiscal analyst, Jenna Hoffer, to relay the November forecast. And whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Good morning. My name is Jenna Hofer. I am the nonpartisan fiscal analyst assigned to this committee. This morning, I was asked to give the committee an update on the November 2024 forecast as it relates to the education finance budget jurisdiction. So this morning, I will begin by giving you a brief overview of the role of nonpartisan staff. Since this is the beginning of the legislative session, it's always good to remember how nonpartisan staff can serve this committee and assist you in your legislative work. We will then look at the education finance budget jurisdiction as it has shifted ever so slightly since the previous legislative session. Before we dive into the education finance budget, we'll look at the all funds budget, the general fund budget, and then the property tax budget. So to begin, nonpartisan staff serve this committee in a number of capacities. So I serve as the fiscal analyst to the committee, Mr. Arneson serves as the legislative analyst, and Ms. Lewis serves as the counsel to the committee. We are here to offer confidential analysis and advice to members of the committee and bill authors to assist them in achieving their legislative goals. We can assist with drafting bills for the committee and drafting amendments, as well as analyzing spending, revenue, and policy proposals. I'm available to assist with interpreting fiscal notes on bills related to education finance, and I will also provide the committee from time to time with budget tracking documents that assist with understanding the effect of legislative decisions. You'll see those at various points throughout the session. They typically correspond with the economic forecasts, the governor's budget proposal, as well as the release of this committee's omnibus budget, and then through conference committee. Nonpartisan staff also advise the committee chairs and members on parliamentary procedure, and we also assist with legislative oversight of enacted budgets. And finally, Ms. Lewis is also available to offer legal advice and opinions upon request. As a reminder, our services are available to all members of the Senate regardless of political party, and our work is confidential between us and the members who requested our services. As I mentioned, the education finance budget jurisdiction has shifted a bit since the last legislative session. This committee still has jurisdiction over appropriations to the Department of Education, the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board, the Perpich Center for Arts Education, and the Minnesota State Academies. Beginning this year, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families will also receive appropriations from this committee related to early childhood programs. This slide shows how the budget jurisdictions have shifted a little bit for early childhood education appropriations. The early childhood appropriations on this slide in the three separate boxes were previously all appropriated by this committee to the Department of Education. Now about a third of those appropriations will be made directly to the Department of Education, while the remainder will go to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families appropriations will be divided between the Education Finance Committee and the Health and Human Services Committee. So the Education Finance Committee on this slide is shown in the blue bar at the top, and it has jurisdiction over the appropriations on the left side and the center of the slide, while the Health and Human Services Committee has jurisdiction over the appropriations on the right hand of the slide. The appropriations in the center column are primarily being made to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, but will be transferred in large part to the Department of Education according to statute. There are a handful of programs that have administrative costs associated with them, and those administrative costs will also be part of this committee's budget jurisdiction to ensure that decisions made by this committee related to those programs don't bind the hands of other committees. And with a number of the appropriations in the center column, these tend to be paid on the K-12 aid payment shift. A few of them have levy components as well. And so that was the primary reason the Education Committee will retain jurisdiction over those appropriations. Next, we will turn to the E12 Education All Funds budget. So this slide looks at all funds that enter state coffers and are then a part of the E12 Education budget and appropriated to those state agencies that I previously mentioned. For the 2026-2027 biennium, the education-based budget is $27.8 billion, with about 92% of that coming from the general fund, which is about $25.5 billion. The next largest portion of the budget comes from federal funds at just shy of $2 billion, or 7.2% of the E12 education budget. This is primarily for Title I programming, special education programming, and nutrition programming. The remaining 1% of the E12 education budget is from the Special Revenue Fund, Permanent School Fund, and Gift Fund. This next slide shows a comparison of the end of the 2024 legislative session to the November 2024 forecast. And with this, you can see that from fiscal year 2024-25 at the end of session to the November forecast, there was a slight reduction in appropriations. It was a reduction of about $8 million, or 0.03% below the end of session. And for the fiscal year 2026-27 biennium, there was a reduction of about $95.8 million, or 0.37% from the end of session. For the 28-29 biennium, you don't see a column for the end of session because it was not included at budget tracking documents at that time. Now, most of the reductions that you see from the end of session to the November forecast are primarily due to lower pupil counts, which would reduce general education aid appropriations. However, pupil counts for some programs are up. These would be things like post-secondary enrollment options and special education child counts. At the same time that we see reductions in general education appropriations, we also see higher appropriations from the end of session for a couple of programs. Primarily, the increases are driven by special education programming and transportation costs, as well as updated growth assumptions, as well as increases in appropriations for school breakfast and school lunch, which are updated as a result of actual participation counts, as well as growth assumptions and changes in the CPI that's used to project meal reimbursement costs. This slide isolates the difference between each of the bienniums in the forecast. So you can see that there tends to be growth in the education budget between bienniums. The fiscal year 2024-25 actual appropriations are approximately $24.5 billion. They will grow to a projected $25.5 billion in the 26-27 biennium, which is $985 million, or 4% above the fiscal year 2024-2025 biennium. From the 26-27 biennium to the 2028-2029 biennium, appropriations are projected to grow to $27.1 billion, which is $1.59 billion, or 6.2% above the fiscal year 2026-2027 biennium. The story here is a little bit different from the previous slide. We tend to see growth from the fiscal year 24-25 biennium to the fiscal year 2026-27 biennium, primarily driven by increases in special education aid and general education aid. These are the two primary factors that drive growth between that biennium, despite the reduction in pupil counts that we tend to see. These increases between the biennia are actually offset by reductions for a number of things. The first is the transfer of appropriations from the Department of Education to the Department of Children, Youth, and Family. We also see reductions in one-time spending in the fiscal year 2024-2025 biennium for programs such as UI for hourly workers, the READ Act, and other grant programming. Growth from the 2026-2027 biennium to the 2028-2029 biennium continues to be driven by increases in special education aid as well as general education aid. This slide isolates the spending for the fiscal year 2026-2027 biennium. Under the November forecast, the base budget for this biennium is $25.5 billion from the general fund, and this is about 38.6% of all general fund expenditures. As you can see, the vast majority of education spending is for general education and special education. For the 26-27 biennium, $17.2 billion, or 67.4% of the budget is for general education aid, and $5.8 billion, or 22.6% of the budget is for special education aid. The remainder of the spending is shown here, primarily grouped by the omnibus structure of the committee. So we tend to have funding for education excellence and teachers. So this would be things like a number of the categorical programs and grant programs, as well as funding that is going towards teachers. And this would be about $1.1 billion, or 4.3% of the budget. Nutrition programming has increased compared to previous bienniums with the introduction of the free school meals program. It's grown to 2.6% of the budget, or $659 million. Facilities and technology spending has remained fairly constant at about 1% of the education budget, or $250 million for the 26-27 biennium. Early education spending is down compared to previous bienniums because of the transfer of appropriations from the Department of Education to the Department of Children, Youth, and Family. We now see that as about 0.7% of the budget, or $165 million. Spending for the state agencies, so this would be the Department of Education, the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board, the Purpose Center for Arts Education, and the Minnesota State Academies, has remained at about 0.5% of the budget, or $137 million for the biennium. And the remaining about 1% of the budget goes to lifelong learning programs. So these would be programs like adult basic education, library programs, and community education programs. In total, that brings spending for the biennium to a projected $25.5 billion. As I mentioned previously, much of the growth from biennium to biennium is driven by spending in general education aid. So a large part of this is changes from the 2023 legislative session that index the basic formula allowance to inflation. And so beginning in fiscal year 2026, the formula allowance is to be increased by the greater of 2% or the rate of inflation, which is CPI, and it's not to exceed 3%. So this chart shows the projected formula allowances as well as the forecasted inflation adjustment for each of the fiscal years within the forecast period. As I mentioned, general education aid and special education aid are the largest components of the general fund budget for education. However, we've seen changes in the proportion of the budget that go to general education aid and special education aid over the years. This chart shows the general education aid spending from fiscal year 2003 to the projected fiscal year 2029, as well as special education aid and then all other appropriations within the E12 education budget. You can see that in fiscal year 2003, general education aid was approximately 83.7% of the budget, and by fiscal year 2029, it's projected to be 65.9% of the budget. The change in growth is largely due to increases in special education aid, which has grown from about 10.1% of the budget in fiscal year 2003, and it's projected to end at about 24.5% of the budget in fiscal year 2029. This is largely due to increases in special education costs. These would be things like program costs for staff salaries and benefits, as well as transportation costs and contracted services. Along with this, we see an increase in the number of special education pupils from fiscal year 2003 to 2029. The remainder of the E12 education budget has remained fairly constant at just under 10% of the budget. It's grown from 6.2% in fiscal year 2003 and is projected to be approximately 9.6% in 2029. You see a slight increase in fiscal year 2024 and 25 due to one-time spending in this biennium. The final component of the E12 education budget is the property tax budget. And so these would be dollars raised by school districts that go to counties, and then the counties distribute the funding to the school districts. So this would not be shown as part of the all funds slide because these dollars don't actually enter the state coffers. For the fiscal year 2026-2027 biennium, total certified levies are projected to be just under $8 billion. Most of this comes through general funds for school districts. So these would be levies such as local optional, referendum. You also see the alternative teacher compensation aid or capital tech levies as well in this program. The Community Service Fund is about $192 million of the budget, so these would primarily be community education programs. So you'll see the general community education levy in here, early childhood family education, and the school age care levy. The Debt Service Fund is projected to be $2.8 billion of the budget, and this is primarily for construction projects for school districts. So districts would use these funds to repay principal and interest on the bonds that were borrowed for construction projects. The final component of the levies is the other post-employment benefits or the pension debt service portion of the budget. This is $37 million of the budget, so it's a relatively small portion of the budget. In total, this puts school district levies at about $8.3 billion for the biennium. However, credits and adjustments, primarily due to the school district building bond ag credit, would offset these increases and would show a reduction of $275 million to property taxpayers, which gets you to the total certified levies of just under $8 billion. And with that, members, I want to mention a couple of additional resources for you. In your committee packets, you will find budget tracking spreadsheets for the November forecast. There are two of them. There is an aid appropriation tracker that lists all of the appropriations made by this committee previously, and it shows them from the end of session and compares them to the November forecast. You'll also have the levy tracking spreadsheet in your packet, which shows property tax levies that are under this committee's purview. Additionally, you can find the spreadsheets available on Senate Council's website. I have a link in the presentation to Minnesota Management and Budget's forecast documents, as well as a fiscal issue brief published by Senate Council that helps you better understand the budget process. With that, members, I am glad to take any questions.
Thank you for that very thorough overview. Members, do you have any questions? Senator Cruen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this may be in the additional resources part that you provided, or it could possibly be in a spreadsheet, but I figured I'd just ask the question. You might know it off the top of your head. When we're looking at the nutrition programming of $659 million some, and obviously that's due in large part to the free breakfast and lunch program. How much, to give me some perspective on that, can you attribute a specific dollar amount to this new program? Where was it before we had this program versus where it is now, to try to pinpoint what the costs are for that program?
Ms. Hofer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So members, Senator Cruen, to your question, on the aid appropriation tracking spreadsheet on page 4, you'll see the nutrition programs beginning on line 140. And so with this, it only shows from the fiscal year 2024 forecast and beyond. And so because the free school meals program began in fiscal year 2024, the school breakfast and school lunch lines would already include appropriations for the free school meals program. Prior to the introduction of the free school meals program, so this would be fiscal years 2023 and previously, the nutrition programs were about $50 to $60 million of the K-12 budget. And that was on a biennial basis. And so you'll certainly see growth compared to the fiscal year 2022-2023 biennium. And so for the free school meals program, it would be the entirety of lines 142 and 143 of this spreadsheet. For the 26-2027 biennium, that is about $658 million.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No follow-up. I appreciate that, pointing us to the direction on the spreadsheet and giving us that context. Thanks.
Chair Rarick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see, some of the underlined ones are part of the shifted programs, but they're not all zeroing out. Can you help us understand what some of the other shifts might be, why some of these programs still have an appropriation here if they weren't shifted out of here?
Ms. Hofer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair Rarick, to your question, I believe, are you talking about the early childhood education programs specifically, or are you talking about all of the shifted programs?
Chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see a few where it's underlined as, and that's a shifted program. Some of them zero out in the end and some of them do not. I'm just trying to understand what the difference would be if they're shifted. Was that something that shifted in, if there's still a line here, or is that part of the 3 blocks that you showed us, just to try to understand that?
Yes.
Ms. Hofer?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Chair Rarick, for the clarification. I appreciate it. So I'll explain how the early childhood portion of the spreadsheet works. So it begins at the top of page 4, but really those are just the headers. Most of the content is on page 5 of the spreadsheet. So lines 160 through lines 185 are all of the appropriations made to the Department of Education. And so for the fiscal year 2024-2025 biennium, all of those appropriations were made to the Department of Education. Beginning in fiscal year 2026, the vast majority of those appropriations are being made to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and so that's why you see them being zeroed out in column G and later. If you look a little bit further down, beginning on line 186 through line 197, you see appropriations to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Because the department was not established for the fiscal year 2024-2025 biennium, the appropriations had still been made to the Department of Education, so those appropriations are shown further up. However, beginning in fiscal year 2026, you can see that those appropriations are being tracked in column G and over for the lines 187 through 197. And so there's a number of shifted programs, early childhood family education aid, early childhood home visiting aid, health and developmental screening aid, and school readiness aid, which will continue to be paid on the K-12 education aid payment shift. And those appropriations are now shown in column G under the Department of Children, Youth, and Families instead of the Department of Education. However, the Department of Education continues to forecast those programs and will continue to make the payments. So after the appropriation is made to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, they will transfer that funding back to the Department of Education, and the Department of Education will pay school districts so they don't see a disruption in those payments.
Any other questions or comments? Senator Farnsworth?
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 10 of your presentation, you mentioned the state agencies at $137 million. And you mentioned that includes the School for the Deaf and the Blind and the state agency. Maybe I'm missing something. 137 million seems kind of high, even including those. Is part of that money that's used to start the new Department of Children and Families, or is there, I guess, how many employees are we talking about that are, or maybe the department would have to ask them that. So kind of a broad question, but I guess that seems kind of high for one agency with a couple of schools down in Faribault.
Right, so for the state agencies line, this would be agency operations for the Department of Education, the Purpose Center for Arts Education, the state academies for the deaf and blind, and the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. So most of this line is for the Department of Education. The Department of Education is
projected to receive appropriations of $78.8 million for the 2026-2027 biennium. And you can find that on the aid appropriations spreadsheet, page 6, line 240. The state academies appropriation is on page 7. They are projected to receive $34.8 million of appropriations in the 2026-2027 biennium. And then the Purpose Center for Arts Education is projected to receive $16.9 million for the biennium. And Pellsby is projected to receive $7.2 million for the biennium. I don't have a count of FTEs at this point for each agency, but that's something that I can work to get for the committee, if that is okay with you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, Ms. Hofer, for, again, that's very clear and precise information about how we fund our state public education. Appreciate it. Next, we are going to hear from our Kathy Erickson, who is the Director of School Finance for the Minnesota Department of Education, and I believe Adosh Uni, Director of Government Relations, is going to join her. But while we're doing that, Senator Housley, I'd like to welcome you to our committee. Would you just take a second to introduce yourself, tell us what district you represent, and then we ask the question, if you could teach one class, what would you teach?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yep, Senator Housley. I represent Senate District 33, which is Stillwater, Forest Lake, and the surrounding St. Croix Valley. Both my parents were public school teachers. My dad taught history and Phi-Ed. I don't want to teach any of those classes. You know what? If I could teach one class, I would probably bring home economics back. That was my favorite class in high school. So, did you? Oh, yeah. We'll stick to that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you and welcome. All right. Ms. Erickson, if you are ready, would you please introduce yourself and you can begin your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Kathy Erickson. I'm the Director of School Finance at the Minnesota Department of Education, and we are presenting this morning regarding some expenditure trends and pupil count trends related to state special education aid. Our overview of the presentation is that we will provide the purpose of state special education aid, the elements that is related to state special education calculations, how aid ties to expenditures, cross-subsidy history, pupil trends, and expenditure trends. So we've taken an excerpt from our special education funding and data reference guide here just to clarify that general education revenue is used to cover the basic costs for each child, including those with disabilities, and the legislative desire to share the burden of these extra costs, which is our state special education aid, with local education agencies. So there is always general education aid tied to every student, regardless of whether they are have an IEP or not, but then we have these additional funding sources to help support those. The components to our state special education formula are our initial aid, excess cost aid, special transportation, a charter school tuition adjustment, a hold harmless, which applies to only school districts, our cross-subsidy reduction aid, and our homeless transportation aid. So we have several components that draw into what we call our state special education aid. The components of those calculations that we just talked about yield a single state special education amount that is loaded into our, what we call our IDEAS system, and for payments for our LEAs, which are our districts, charters, co-ops, and intermediates. So when we talk about the different elements of special education, our districts and charters and others see those as one payment, even though there's multiple calculations that go into the calculation for state special education aid. We also provided you with some statute links here where you can find the different calculations that draw into that one state aid amount.
So unlike many of our other other funding formulas that use a pupil count to drive funding, state special education uses a reimbursement basis for calculating our aids and rates. Of the aid categories, each will have distinct components or formulas that will drive the calculation and the reimbursement amounts. And in certain cases, the reimbursement may only apply to a certain percentage of eligible expenditures. Each LEA will have an individualized expenses based on their programs and needs, so reimbursement will also be uniquely based on what expenditures are approved and reported. So we have a graph here that's showing the history of our cross-subsidy reduction aid. The red dashed line would be adjusted for inflation in the past, so you could see what the cost today would be, and then not adjusted for inflation is the blue line. And just for reference, we started the additional special education cross-subsidy aid at 44% in fiscal year 24. So we have gone from a distribution in fiscal year 23 of just over $56 million, which was at 6.43%, now moving to fiscal year 24 at 44%, and that total now for fiscal year 24 is about $412 million. And then forecasting all the way out to fiscal year 29, we would be at about $614 million for total cross-subsidy aid reduction distributions based on the November forecast. We also have a slide that is showing some of our special education pupil count projections and some history. And again, these are all based on the November 2024 forecast. And what we wanted to note here is that we are continuing to see a growth in the number of students qualifying for special education services. And you can see that in the navy blue circled area, where in fiscal year 25, we are estimating approximately 173,000 students qualifying for special education. But by fiscal year 2029, based on our forecast information, that is being projected just over 197,000 students. And again, we also see this for the February 2024. We also noted back when we did this a year ago that we were looking at closer to 170,000. So we did see an increase of the number of students qualifying for IEPs between February of 24 and the latest November forecast. We also wanted to point out a program called ADSIS, or Alternative Delivery of Specialized Instructional Services. This is a program, not a grant. We hear that often that ADSIS might be considered a grant. It is actually a calculation of the state special education formula. These students are not currently having an IEP. This program is to support these students to maybe not be able to have to qualify for special education services, but they are included in our special education funding formulas. And we just wanted to note here the increased participation since 18-19 through fiscal year 24. Participations in programs and LEAs went from 162 in fiscal year 19 to 246 in 2024. And you can see the expenditures starting in 19 were around 58 million, and now in 2024, they're over $106 million for this program. Again, this is part of that one total number. ADSIS is included in one of the criteria for state special education revenue. We also now wanted to spend a little time talking about expenditure trends. These information is, again, from our state special education supervisor, Paul Farron, and his team at MDE. And again, these are collection of information for fiscal years 23 and 24, just as a comparison. So you can see that our employee wage comparison is that wages did go up for eligible teacher, other licensed administration, and non-licensed employees, about 8.25% between fiscal years 23 and 24. And you can see the categorical differences here. Teachers, about 8% are other licensed, a little over 8.25%, administration 6%, and our non-licensed as a highest percent of about 9.69%. Here is the data that goes along with that chart on slide 12, so that you can see the dollar amounts here by category of district, charter, or other cooperative units to see that total amount. And then you can also see those percent changes by different LEA types, so you can see the difference that pulled into that 8.25% average. We also looked at a comparison of fiscal year 23 and 24 with our contracted services under state special education. And you can see here that we had a increase of 22.6%, but note that the total cost is much smaller than our employee-based expenditures. But we are seeing an increase in the number of LEAs that are choosing to use contracted services. And again, you can see those comparative differences in certain cases over 30%, non-licensed staff up to almost 40%. And again, comparatively, for total for this year, compared in 23 and 24 was about 22.6%. And on slide 14, again, we put the data that goes along with that chart here. So again, you can see the percent changes and differences in the utilization of contracted services and special education, and the amount changes from 23 to 24. We also wanted to highlight special transportation expenditures on slide 15. What this is showing is the contracted versus non-contracted or district or owned employee-driven transportation. And again, what we wanted to show here was, one, that we are seeing an increase in overall transportation costs, but what we also wanted to point out is that we are also seeing an increase in the number of contracted transportation rather than having district-owned fleets and buses. We did want to point out in fiscal year 21, this was our pandemic year, so we did not have as much transportation expenditure due to remote and not being in school. But again, we just wanted to share the increasing amount of our contracted versus non-contracted and the overall costs of our transportation services going up. We also wanted to highlight that the charter school tuition aid adjustment is a component of special education revenue. This aid would cover 10% of the charter school's unreimbursed costs. So when charter schools tuition bill out and then they are not able to collect, the Department of Education does a calculation and we provide that additional aid to make sure that that gap gets covered. This started when in fiscal year 20, when we moved from 90-10 to 85-15, and then in fiscal year 21, when it was dropped to 80%, 20%. So again, this is an investment that MDE does to support the costs of charter school special education. And in a final review, we just wanted to show the what we're seeing for rationale behind the expenditure increases. We are seeing increases in salary and wages impacted by contracts and also the increase in staff. We are seeing an increase in FTE by districts. We are also, again, seeing that contracted service expenditure going up. The tuition charter agreements are going up. And we have more students receiving IEP services and more students supporting the ADSES program. And again, the increased cost of transportation, including those contracted sped transportation increases that we're seeing. And with that, I am open for any questions.
Chair Rarick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First question I have when we're talking about the special education requirements, I know that it's come from the federal government, but does the state of Minnesota have any requirements above and beyond the federal requirements for our schools in providing special education services?
Ms. Rarick, excuse me, Ms. Erickson.
Mr. Chair, members, we do have increased coverage and expectations as a state versus the federal. We do have some information that we can provide you from past history of the explanations, and I know government relations could also address that.
And, Mr. Chair, just for the record, Ado Shuni, Director of Government Relations for the Minnesota Department of Education. Outside of Ms. Erickson's expertise in school finance, there would be requirements in the program area, and so we have a special education program area division that we could also go back to and find information if you'd like some follow-up there as well.
Another one now. In regards to the transportation costs, do you have a breakdown that would help us understand for areas of the state? Because I would assume, you know, transportation is probably higher in very rural areas, but would you have a breakdown so we would be able to see, according to different areas of the state, maybe where increases in transportation have come from or where they're higher?
Mr. Chair and members, I will reach out to our special education funding supervisor and we can get that information for you. I don't have it right here with me, but yes, we would be able to look at district by district and other LEA's costs.
And Ms. Erickson, when you share that with Senator Rarick, would you share it with the rest of us as well? Great. I have a couple questions. On slide number 9, where you're looking at the pupil count projection, how do you calculate that? How do you calculate up to 2029 in anticipation that we will have that, especially when we see the decline in enrollment? You know, that trend is going that way, but SPED is going up. How do you calculate that?
Part of our team, again, in the special education funding area, utilizes the information that we get for the number of IEPs, the number of trends that we. Farron is on.
Yes, he is.
Paul Farron is our supervisor of special education funding who created this particular slide on this page. And I don't know if Paul would be able to give you a little more detail, Madam Chair.
Mr. Farron, do you have anything to add?
Yes, good morning, Chair and members. So this forecast is based on a 2-year weighted average of changes in the 4 categories of disabilities. The 4 categories came out of the 2016 formula change, whereby certain funding or certain disability types were allocated to funding level 1, 2, 3, and 4, just based on severity of cost and on average for these programs. And then now each of those 4 categories, we're taking a 2-year weighted average on their growth overall in special ed, and then in comparison to total resident district ADMs. And so even though we are seeing a decrease in total resident district ADMs, that growth rate of just the percentage of students representing that have IEPs is still growing faster, which is therefore causing the total percentage of students with disabilities to start exceeding more and more each year.
Thank you.
Which has been typical going back all the way to 2003 when the state was closer to 13% of total students having identified with an IEP, where most recent year of 2024, we were around 19.5%.
And so my question to you is, when you look back on the projections from the past, have they been close to accurate to what the actuality was?
Generally, they've been within a 1,000. Obviously with the pandemic and learning loss that we've seen, additional VPK slots so there's more identification, especially on some of the speech language disabilities coming in that have added to this, but they generally have been fairly close, minus the pandemic years.
Thank you. And then I have one more question on slide 17, where it talks about the increase in salary and wages by contract and staff, increases in contracted service expenditures. Does MDE see those district contracts for the independent contractors? And are you part of their negotiation, MDE, when I say you? Does MDE work with the schools in getting, negotiating, a reasonable contract?
No, the schools have local control, so we are not able to be at the table for what they are negotiating for rates. Instead, because special education for reimbursableness needs to be reasonable, allocable, towards eligibility costs, we, in some cases, are coming in on the backside if all schools are basically reporting their expenditures within a special education data reporting application that administer here at MDE. Within there's a number of edits built in, both total cost based on each personnel type code, so position type, along with rates of pay. And so anytime an edit gets triggered whereby the rate of pay is in excess of what the norm is for those, or also just the total cost, we're generally reviewing those. We then see copies of contracts to verify that what was entered in and charged to the individual was correct. But in some cases where we are seeing higher rates, then they might not get full approval based on just what they agreed to for costs, or similarly, rates per pay per hour, or just total agreement, or again, time and effort as to what documentation was ultimately provided.
Thank you. And is that information available to the public, to the schools, their school boards, their communities, or is that kept confidential?
The rate caps themselves are generally kept confidential, because if we post them on public, we've generally then had vendors use that information to go to schools to say, just pay me at the max of what this is, rather than them trying to negotiate as well. Although most LEAs could probably quickly figure out by just manipulating the data that they're entering on an individual line to see where the error comes in and where it does not.
Thank you. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I don't really have questions. I just kind of want to make some comments. The last gentleman that spoke actually hit on some of the stuff that I was thinking about. He said back in 2003, about 13% of our student population was being served in this special education program. And that lines up with when I was working on my master's degree in special ed. They said at that time that research shows that 13% should sort of be the target. And this would have been 2007, 2008. And so back then we were at the target, and now we're at 19%. In some districts, a lot of the districts in my Senate district are even higher than that 19%. But it occurred to me that we often look at this and we respond and say, well, okay, well, there's 19% of the kids in special education. We should increase funding in order to help schools pay for this. And we don't look at it and say, well, what can we do to reverse the trend? And I can say that I'm confident that the READ Act is going to help, because what they were doing for 20 years, teaching kids with a whole language model, was just stupid. Resilient readers could still learn how to read pretty well, but kids that were naturally likely to struggle with reading were going to struggle, and then they were going to be tested and placed into special ed. And so I think the READ Act is really going to help with the numbers as far as specific learning disabilities. But I think we really have to look and say, well, what can we do to reverse this trend? And I just want to give an example from my district during COVID and right after COVID. So I'm one of the special ed evaluators for the Hibbing School District. So I'm sort of the gatekeeper. I do the testing, and we determine whether kids qualify. And we saw numbers going up, especially with specific learning disabilities. And then we got a bunch of COVID money in 21, and they're like, well, how do we spend this? And they hired some interventionists for the 2 elementary schools. And this is anecdotal. I didn't count anything, but we noticed a sharp decrease in kids that were tested for specific learning disabilities in those 2 buildings when they hired intervention specialists. And I think we have to, and this is committee, when we're looking at planning, how are we going to spend the public's money on education this year? I really think we have to look at, can we fund more intervention problem in math? Because the research with Common Core math is pretty abysmal. It's not as bad as what the reading research was, but it's not great. So I think we're gonna have to, I don't know if they're gonna call it the science of math, just like they did the science of reading. But I think we're gonna start to see some of those same things where they're gonna be like, okay, we need the state to pay for this math curriculum so that we can move away from the Common Core. That's really, the best research on Common Core is that it has the same effect as the way we all learned how to read. Most of the research says that it has a negative effect. And again, when you take kids like me who aren't very resilient at math, surprise to everybody in here, they're going to struggle in math and probably end up getting tested for special education. So I think that's a long way of saying we really have to look at what can we do to reverse this trend. And my argument would be we have to fund intervention specialists on the front end, and then we'll be doing a lot less funding of special ed programs on the back end. So no questions, just a sort of a long comment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Farnsworth. And, if you have ideas about how that should work, let us know. If you have any ideas about how to reverse the math issue, please, bring it forward, and we'll be happy to look at that and talk about that as well. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us, and again, the wealth of information. I just want to remind the folks that are interested in education finance, if you at some point want to testify, if you are an advocacy group or an expert in some of the areas, we will be encouraging virtual testimony again this year, but we want you to know that the handouts have to be submitted to our committee administrator, Emma Zellmer, by 1 p.m. the day before the hearing. So if you have anything that you want to share with us, if you want to testify, please reach out to Emma as soon as you hear the topic we are discussing that you want to participate in. And if you want to testify in person or virtual, it is very helpful for her to know that as well. Just to remind everybody, Senator Rarick will have the gavel tomorrow morning. I don't believe we will have a hearing on Thursday. And with that, we are adjourned.